into a session where the content is about the notion of patriotism. And we know that in American life right now, conservatives claim to have a hold and ownership of patriotism. But Ivory has got some thoughts about this. And so Ivory's going to take this session. And Ivory, we're starting a little late, obviously at 12:30, but just take it for as long as you want, okay?
Yes, sir. Can everybody see the screen? Can you see that? Okay. Yeah, so a little backstory on the clock. That belongs to my Nana. She was born in Kentucky. I don't remember the last time I actually had this clock plugged up. I used it when I was in high school. Um, but that was a little while ago. So, shout out to the clock. But thank you all for hanging in there. I hope to make this as interactive as possible. Good energy, and we are going to talk about repatriating America. If you are unfamiliar with that term, we will go over that here in a bit. But one of my favorite things to do whenever I teach, is to go over current events. So that is where we are going to start today. These were actually the current events of the first, but since the clock is turned over and it is the second, I changed the date. But Hurricane Beryl is currently making landfall in the Caribbean as a Category 5. So keep the people in our thoughts who are embracing that storm. Speaking about patriotism and the functions of our country, Steve Bannon had a report to federal prison today for defying a congressional subpoena. He could have showed up and said, "Hey, I plead the fifth and I choose not to say anything." But he said, "I'm not going to abide by a lawful subpoena. Therefore, he is going to prison." In Virginia, their Department of Education is reviewing changes to an African American history course or courses to the point where they are looking to change or remove phrases like white supremacy and racism. So we have that going on in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And then obviously what we've been talking about, our Supreme Court case, where presidential immunity has taken a little bit of a turn. So those are the current events. I try to ground whatever I teach in what's happening in the world. So we will continue. First and foremost, America's existence is inextricably linked to the forced sacrifices of Native and Indigenous peoples. Their lands, lives, and cultures were irrevocably altered by European settlers and their pursuit of religious and economic freedoms. Freedoms that were denied under colonial rule prior to the ventures to the New World. The legacy of colonial rule, marked by exploitation and displacement, continues to shape our society today, influencing systematic inequalities and injustices that persist. We must acknowledge this painful history as we strive for a future rooted in truth and justice. So when I talk about the ideals of patriotism and repatriating America, it is not to dismiss that this land that we call America belong to those that you see in these images, and these are images from the Library of Congress. So paying a much owed debt to those that came well before the establishment of the country. So in the chat, if you could, what do you think about when you see or hear the word patriot or patriotism, or what are some of the first things that come to your mind as you see that on your screens? So go ahead and drop that in the chat if you will. We have nationalism, fighters, World War II and those that fought in it. Okay. White supremacist groups, proud, now, hijacked. Yes. Rebels. Okay. Military members, loyalty to the principles of the USA. Okay. Keep those in mind as we go through this here. Um, thank you for those contributions. And if you still have some, go ahead and put those into the chat as we go. Anybody know what this number is representative of? Anybody want to take a guess? You can either unmute or drop that in the chat as well. Anyone? Anyone? All right. I'll answer that at the end. So 248, keep that number in mind as well as we go through this. So what is a patriot? These definitions come from dictionary.com. So the first one, a person who loves, supports, and defends their country and its interest with devotion. Okay. And number two, a person who values individual rights, especially one who attempts to defend those rights against presumed interference by the federal government. So, thinking about all of the different definitions that you all put in the chat, or the things that at least came to your mind when you hear the word patriot or think about patriotism, these are the definitions, right? So, anybody that is calling themselves a patriot should be those who support and love and defend their country with some sort of devotion, okay? And then those same people who call themselves patriots should also value individual rights. Okay, I'm thinking about women in particular and the individual right to govern themselves and the choices that they should have to make. So again, keeping those things in mind. So to situate all of this, okay, to repatriate something, that means to restore or return to the country of origin, allegiance, or citizenship. So repatriating America, restoring America to its origin. And if we think about the origin, we think about 1776, which is why 248, when the 4th of July comes, it'll be America's 248th birthday. Okay, but America is founded on this idea. Okay. President Biden says that all the time. America is founded on an idea, which couldn't be more true. You have people that decided because of what they were going through in a certain place, they're going to come here and they're going to create this wonderful land of opportunities, which, in fact, I mean, we're able to sit on a Zoom, talking to one another, listening to civil rights icons, people who are actually in the thick of things with Dr. King. Um, I don't imagine the founding fathers could have ever seen this coming, or the framers of the Constitution. So to repatriate, right? To repatriate, how can we on this call, and then what we do after this with this hope and determination, how can we repatriate the idea of both patriotism and what America really is, which was a cry for civil liberties? Okay. So anybody want to take a stab at what this is? Anybody at all? Okay, Statue of Liberty, right? The honest answer. So, what are some things that the Statue of Liberty represent to you? Aside from just liberty, what does that actually mean to not just you, but maybe the country as a whole, right? I see people that wear shirts that have the Statue of Liberty, 1776, all of that. Welcoming everyone, immigration. Okay, freedom and hope. Love that. I'm actually going to go back to something that Randy put in the chat. Um, Randy, I don't know if you have my slides or not, but when I see the Statue of Liberty, when I think about the idea of patriotism, this is the man that comes to my mind, and that would be Frederick Douglass. Okay, to be born in this country and not have rights, and to not necessarily even know your birthday, to being invited into the White House, to talk with Abraham Lincoln and discuss things, and being an actual abolitionist, to come from what this country is founded upon to being a part of trying to solve something. To me, that is somebody that is a patriot, because he, just like his ancestors, were fighting for those rights, or at least laid the foundation for those rights to even come to fruition. Okay. So thinking about Frederick Douglass, thinking about the idea of patriotism, how many people could you make mad by calling Frederick Douglass a patriot when they might have this idea of patriotism that fits their own narrative? Okay. So July 5th, 1852. Keep in mind of the year 1852. This is a day after the 4th. Anybody know what happened on this day, especially if we're talking about Frederick Douglass?
Is this the day he gave the speech?
Absolutely.
The 4th of July, like is the famous. You'll say more about it. Yeah. Yes, that's the one.
Yeah. So Frederick Douglass is invited to a celebration for the United States of America that is surrounded and based on freedom and liberty, to which he asked the question, what to a slave is your 4th of July? And making sure that we are clear on terms, right? The word slave is usually used in the context of history. We try to move forward and say enslaved because that gives a little bit more agency to the person. But for the historical record, he says, what to a slave is your 4th of July? So that being said, I was going to read to you and put on my best acting voice, and then there's a guy by the name of James Earl Jones who does it a little bit better. So I'm going to play just a piece of this. I really want you all to really listen to the words in the context of what we're going through today, especially given that the 4th of July is 2 days from now, and the decision that was made by the United States Supreme Court in terms of what a president can and cannot do. So I'm going to play this, and then we will open up space to have a dialogue, and then we'll get into some real patriotism talk.
Today, in this special broadcast, we begin with the words of Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery around 1818, Douglass became a key leader of the abolitionist movement. On July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches, "What to the slave is your 4th of July?" He was addressing the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. This is James Earl Jones reading the historic address during a performance of Voices of a People's History of the United States. It was co-edited by Howard Zinn. The late, great historian introduced the address.
Frederick Douglass, once a slave, became a brilliant and powerful leader of the anti-slavery movement. In 1852, he was asked to speak in celebration of the 4th of July.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a shame. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, how mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a stream, a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
James Earl Jones reading the words of Frederick Douglass. Today in the...
Okay. For a quick second, I have points that I will make, but I would love to open up for this to be a brave space. Can't guarantee safety, right? But we can be brave and share what comes to your mind as you listen to some of those words. I have about 4 connections to make before I move on to the next space. So either you can utilize the chat, or if you want to share your voice with the people, you can. Okay, so Kendra says we need the storm. It's not light that is needed, but fire. Okay, love those contributions as well. Any others? Any others? Okay, hypocrisy. So all those years ago, and then maybe now too, right? Okay. So one of the first things that stood out to me was, okay, bravery of a man acknowledges his heritage and heart. Absolutely. I love that, Shanita. Thank you. Thank you. Driven by emotion and power. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. One of the things that stood out that he says in that speech is talking about the benefits, questioning what this benefit was. And I can't help but to think of a certain governor that made a comment about the benefits of slavery, right? I wonder if he or whomever his team was that was perpetuating that narrative was aware of this speech and the idea that that was being pointed out as a fallacy in 1852. Okay. He says, a day that reveals the unjust and gross cruelty, right? So we celebrate the nation. I am somebody that believes in patriotism. I take great pride in being able to say that I am an American citizen. And I'll get to that in a second. But the idea, right? The idea of patriotism, even then, and what we are dealing with today, how do we get in between those arguments, right? And this is 1852. Okay, this is 1852. So that being said, who defines a patriot, right? Who is responsible for this definition, this anointing, this pointing out of who gets to be a patriot? I think, Luke, you put that in the chat of the term being hijacked. I can't help but to think of how many times, and I can't even count how many times that I have heard people refer to those that were responsible for January 6th as patriots. Okay. I can't remember how many upside down flags or Blue Lives Matter flags or even the Confederate flag that was walked through the halls of Congress on that January 6th day. And I had students, I was teaching during COVID online, and I had my phone set up and I was legitimately watching this happen. And my student said, Mr. Kennedy, what's happening right now? And I had to stop my lesson and help walk them through what we were seeing. And I had no clue. So I reached out to my 8th grade social studies teacher and we had a conversation. I'm like, how do we talk about this? Because people really felt like they were doing the right thing, right? This information is one thing, but this idea that I am defending my country, right? That wasn't about country, that was about a person. And this is not anything political. This is a matter of history happening, right? There was a certain somebody that had his name on flags that were being flown at that time period, okay? And we all know who that is. But it all begs the question, who defines a patriot, okay? I say that it is your history that defines your patriotism. Obviously, I'm a Black guy, and when I say that I love America and that I believe I'm a patriot, that kind of throws people through a loop, because why would you say that, right? But it is because of my history that gives me that sense of pride to claim the country of which I belong to. So the origins of my patriotism. So a little bit about my family history. I am the descendant of an actual Union soldier and Civil War veteran by the name of Benjamin Brinley. I found this out about 3 years ago, doing a little bit of ancestry work and then going down to Kentucky and finding this out. I was, as a former history teacher, American history teacher, I was blown away. I was confused. I didn't understand. I didn't know how I didn't know that already, but it exists. So I am the great grandson of somebody that was alive when Frederick Douglass gave that speech in 1852, speaking about the liberties in which he was not able to enjoy himself, but was brought to speak to an event where people were actually enjoying those liberties that didn't look like him. So that same veteran, who was just a number, okay, he was just a number on George Pugh's plantation in the 1850 US Census. So after tracing back this lineage, the reason I know his name is because the first time it showed up was when he was enlisted into the Civil War. And I'll show you that document here in a second. But prior to that, he was only listed as property on whoever George Pugh is, his plantation. So he was born in 1837. So from the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, you can just see slave handler or farm labor. And you can see his age ticking up each year. And then obviously in the 1860s, there was no census because we have the war. But in 1870, he shows up on that same plantation after the war is over, but his name exists. And so does his daughter, which would have been my great-great-grandmother, Sally Brownlee. So he lives on this plantation as Douglass is giving this speech. And he was a part of what defended the freedoms of this nation, the same freedoms that he didn't have. Which goes back to my question, who defines what a patriot is? So if you look at this document, this is a roll call of the Company I, the 100th Infantry of Colored Soldiers. And they're in that little blurb. So that would be my great-great-great-grandfather right here. And Greenupsburg, Kentucky is situated around Maysville. That is where most of my family, that is where the owner of this clock is from, or was from. Check the message in the chat really quick. Yeah, so coming across this document, it is somewhat unreal. So in Maysville, Kentucky, everybody should make a trip down to Maysville, Kentucky. The original The original Underground Railroad Museum is actually in Maysville, Kentucky. If you've ever been to the Freedom Center, that houses lots of Underground Railroad history in Cincinnati, the reason why it is not officially the Underground Railroad Museum is because of the one that exists in Maysville, Kentucky. And they actually have one of the original books, and I was able to flip through and actually get a physical, touch the physical page that you see here that is scanned in. That museum is also across the street from where Ulysses S. Grant went to school when he was a child. And just a couple houses up from what is called the Beer Bower House, which was a safe place for runaway slaves to go to before they crossed the river to Ohio. That is where my family, so that is where Benjamin Brinley, once he was off of George Pugh's plantation, that is where they kind of started their family. And that's why my mother's side of the family is a product of Maysville, Kentucky. So again, I say all of that to say, right, let us be reminded of what a patriot is. A person who loves, supports, and defends their country and its interests with devotion. I can't help but to think what any of those men who were formerly enslaved that were now being charged with donning a Union uniform and defending what we now enjoy as democracy, when just a few moments, a few hours, a few minutes ago, they were seen as property, right? So going back to what Frederick Douglass said in the beginning, okay, what to a slave is your 4th of July? Well, the 4th of July means independence. And why did this nation secure its independence? Well, the South didn't want that to happen. You are infringing upon our rights. But for some reason, we were able to overcome that. And it's because of the unity that existed, because of the bravery that existed, or dare I say, the patriotism of what people were actually fighting for. Okay. So I have a question for you all in light of Frederick Douglass. What to America in patriotism is the 2024 election? Teaching about the history of this country, loving presidential history, it's amazing to see how far we've come. If anybody is aware of George Washington's farewell address, anybody knows George Washington, he was not trying to become president. They wanted him to be king. He's like, hey. After he serves his 2 terms and steps down when he didn't have to, because people are like, hey, don't do that. He said, listen, I'm going to warn you of 2 things. Beware of foreign entanglements and the evils of political parties. And now we find ourselves situated where we have 2 political parties that seem to be at deep odds with one another, number one. But number 2, a certain party that is no longer interested, or seems no longer interested, in upholding some of those same values that I remember as a kid. I didn't grow up seeing Republicans as enemies or racists. I just knew that it wasn't the party that my mom was necessarily too fond of, but I didn't really understand why. And there's historical reasons to that. But what to America and patriotism is this 2024 election? I think it'd be worth, if we end up listening to President Biden's response as he walked away and didn't take questions, just to hear the fervor that was in his voice when he was speaking. But to me, I kind of sum this up in a couple points. For the natives and the indigenous peoples in this country, we should vote. For the enslaved, we should vote. For Civil War vets, because I don't know if my great-great-great-grandfather got a chance to vote. I know it's documented that he was defending this country to maintain that sense of democracy that guarantees the vote in the first place. But for him, this election, I'll vote. And for all of the patriots, I think about the World War II veterans. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. Think about what the sacrifices were that they made so that we can enjoy what we do today. And for them, I'll vote. And then for democracy, obviously, we live in this time period where we have one presidential candidate who has been very clear in terms of his intentions, and one that seems to be willing to hold the guard and uphold the same ideals that we were founded on. The idea that we as a people, right? We as a people should be entitled to the freedoms and liberties that those that came before us sacrifice. So for democracy, I'll vote. And with that being said, I'll turn it over to any questions that you all have. I appreciate you all listening, giving me the chance to share a little bit about family history, but also understanding that I know my place in American history because I'm a product of that. I'm a product of a patriot. I'm a product of a grandmother who couldn't read or write. I'm a product of American history. And for that, I owe it to myself and my son and future children and the future children of the world. I owe them the right to vote because it was fought for so that I could enjoy that. And with that, I will take any questions, comments, or if we just want to chat about how do we make sure that people vote, we can do that. So thank you for listening.
Miss Shanita has her hand up. Jump
Yes.
on in here, Miss Shanita.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivory. I must say that this presentation has helped me to revise my ideal of patriotism. Because since the even during the Obama administration, seeing at a time where unity was seeming, and we seemed like we were going in the right direction. During 45's reign, it really struck a chord. And for me, as I put in the chat about, I hear patriots now, especially here. Even had the husband of a former teacher at our school to threaten our principal that he was a part of a group of patriots that would come back to the school if he made one phone call. But just being reminded that yes, it's a love, reestablishing a love for our country. And I like the way that you put it in, and that's why I shared. It seems like this election, we got to grab it back. We got to grab back what the true definition of patriotism is. And I want to thank you for that, because I can honestly say it was kind of a sour taste because of the recent events. So thank you for it.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that. To that point, I have fun teaching American history because I try to make sure that my students, or my former students, I used to teach 8th grade, I try to make sure that they saw themselves in the history of the country, whether they had ancestral connections or whether they just understood the development of the country. We made mistakes. We have bumps and bruises. We have some really ugly scars in our past. But if we take a look around and see what it is that we have, it's amazing, because all of this started in behind closed doors in a hot room in Philadelphia, where people said, let's put pen to paper and really do this thing. And it took a lot to maintain that. I think about Dr. King. We don't really refer to him as a patriot, but why not? He was born on this soil, and he spent his entire life trying to figure out how he can get us over the mountaintop. I think about Dr. Lafayette. That is a living patriot. That is an American patriot. Imagine if we teach kids that that's the idea of patriotism. If we taught kids that Harriet Tubman and people like John Lewis, those are patriots. Why? Because they uphold to the true definition of what that is, not this idea that makes people comfortable. But patriotism is a fight, not a fight for wrong, but a fight for everyone's right. So I just, whatever you do, whenever you go back to whatever corners that exist, think about reimagining and rewording and just feeling the way that you should about the country that you live in. Because all of us on this call that are up at whatever hour, learning about this and sharing the space to do something about what it is that we hope to be a part of. That's patriotism work. Why? Because we're doing the work of the country. We're doing the work for the people, right? So yeah. Other thoughts, questions, comments, feelings?
I'm just going to point to a question in the chat. This is from Linda, and she just asks about, I got to scroll up to find it. It says, other than folks died for the right to vote, quote unquote, what can you say to folks who don't or won't vote?
I asked them the question, if we could go back in time, if I could just talk to my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1924, not the owner of this clock, but on my dad's side of the family, on a plantation in Alabama, in Lowndes County. I don't know if she ever voted or not. I'll see if I can drop the link to an interview that she did when Obama was elected. What would any of them say? Not just people who died for the right to vote, because that is a very that's too broad. There are people that physically died for that. There are people that were abused for that. The whole nine yards, right? What would a indigenous person who saw their entire livelihood change because of European settlers, what would they vote for if they had the chance? What would anybody that has not been included in the ideas of America as it was written on paper, what would the people who were victims of the 3/5 clause, because I wouldn't say that they necessarily died for the right to vote, because they were property, and a lot of them were born into slavery and then died as enslaved people, never having a chance or a conception of what this country was supposed to be like for them. What would they do? What would they vote for right now? Knowing what they were not able to access when they were alive, and then having a candidate that is saying all of the things that they are. I respect my elders. I wasn't too happy with the debate performance that happened. However, one person on that stage who's not a convicted felon, because evidence is evidence and facts are facts, one of those people has worked tirelessly, was connected to history, both Kamala Harris and President Barack Obama, has not said anything about taking away anything in terms of our right to vote. I mean, the framers intended for us to use our power. Maybe not people that look like me, but hey, it works out in our favor. So I say to them, what does being an American mean to you then? Because America is about our participation at the ballot. So short question, long-winded answer. Anything else in terms of patriotism?
Ivory, I think I've seen you one time with, or at least one time when you've been in your office at school, and done Zooms. Do you have a couple flags up on the wall?
Yes. So I have my bookshelf behind me, and the glass in my bookshelf reflects the flags that are hanging above me. So I have an American flag that hangs here, and then a Black Lives Matter flag that hangs right next to it. And I do that on purpose, because it throws people off and it starts a good conversation, or it makes people very uncomfortable when they walk into my office. But I do that very strategically.
And how often would you say that on the campus there that you see those two flags put together in any kind of spaces?
Not often. I think that is almost taboo, because we have gotten to a point where they mean two different things. A lot of people, and I used to be somebody that would see the American flag and I would have this resentment. I would have this negative reaction. I would have this nasty feeling because I felt so excluded from those ideals, but that's because I didn't really understand what patriotism meant. I can't imagine how much more I would have participated in my history classes in high school if I would have known that I had lineage that was in the Civil War, because I can see myself in America's story versus the usual narrative that, you go from being enslaved and then all of a sudden you're free, and then you got the civil rights movement, and then what happens in any of that in between. And a lot of my students did not have a good teaching of American history, if anything at all. So when they come into my office, it's usually a point of conversation because they ask me why, or you have a lot of American history stuff, because I also have the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the signing of that in Philadelphia, and the Gettysburg Address. And I just link all of that together because, I mean, I would argue that my great 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 grandfather believed that Black Lives Matter when he was donning the Union uniform, because it did. And those two things can coexist. And I think if we were to couple that, it would piss those patriots off to a point where they couldn't understand. Because that's why I love being able to say, yes, I believe in patriotism. Absolutely, I'm a patriot. Because either you'll show your true colors as a racist, or you'll have trouble accepting that I am adopting the same term that you may be adopting, but you're weaponizing that against me because you don't see me as an American citizen, but I was born here, so let's talk about it. Yeah.
Let's take Lily's question as the last piece here.
Yeah.
I was more just thinking out loud, but I was just that was well, one, I really like the way you described patriotism. It's interesting because not too long ago, I had a lot of discussions with friends of mine and other like really intelligent students. But there was this ongoing kind of like theme of um rejecting like the US, becoming resentful of it and hating it, and a lot of people who didn't want to vote because they were so angry at the system. um and so I just really I like the way that you kind of, yeah, I think you explained it well. I trying to think of how to, I think, I mean, I grew up in like my father was like Trumpy, like very, and my mom was not. And so it was like I got to see both sides of it. So it's interesting because he always called himself a patriot. And my mom was always like, "Oh, I hate America. I want to leave America, blah, blah, blah." And so, but I feel like as I've like been able to take history classes and like learn more about the history, and as you described it, that was just really really good. And I think it definitely changes my perspective on it. And you put it into good words. Hopefully I'll be able to bring that up the next time I have conversations with my friends about it. Yeah.
Shout out to you for having those conversations, and to the point where that resentment grows. Ask the question, be open-ended. If there were enough of us that had the idea of patriotism that was inclusive for all of us that were born here and want to do the right thing for the majority of the people, then why wouldn't we vote? Because if there were enough of us that could say that together out loud, we would drown out all of that nonsense, because either it's rooted in misinformation or it's rooted in hate or both. And that's not where I come from. I'll accept any Trump supporter that's willing to hear me out, because 9 times out of 10, I can pinpoint where your issue might be, but it doesn't make anybody less American than the other. So I would just pose the question of hope. And I mean, that's what this whole thing is about. So good for you for having those conversations, and yeah, good stuff. Can't hear you, David.
Looks like Faye's still in the game here. She got something too. Faye.
Yeah, it might, as I'm listening, it reminds me of, I'm not going to get all the words right, where James Baldwin makes a statement of how fiercely he loves America, and then with that, having that ability to be able to criticize her to be better. And for again, and to me, that always resonates with me of, it's patriotic to want a better America or a better United States. And you'll sometimes get that backlash when we do the criticism of becoming better and moving toward those ideas that are so powerful, but we've got still such a ways to go. But that struck me when I about that the quote that Baldwin says about that.
In order to form a more perfect union is my argument. It
Keep
is always.
going.
Hmm?
What? Keep going.
I mean, in order to form a more perfect union, right? We have to rest in the ideas of what would be more perfect. What is more perfect than what was happening at the signing of the Declaration and the signing of the Constitution? What would be more perfect than that? Inclusion, no slavery, women's rights, schools for children. I mean, I think about it. Frederick Douglass is a man who was born as a slave, sold. And his narrative writes about hearing the whelps and cries of people being whipped as a child. And then to be able to dissect the words that were written in the Declaration and written in the Constitution and use that against the argument or use that against the actions of these people. And he wasn't allowed to go to school. How dare we sometimes not embrace what patriotism is, because look at what he was able to do, because he believed in the idea that was written not for him, but for the country. And we, the people, are what make the country. Therefore, if we have enough, I guess, positive education or just honest education, then there's really nothing that we can't do. Seeing eighth graders light up and really understand and be able to put together an argument about why the preamble should be changed this way and be more inclusive, to see all of these kids from different places, first generation Americans, their concept of America, and me being able to teach that. It has nothing to do with me. It's just a facilitation of the content, but their grasp of that content and them taking on this own identity of saying, well, yeah, I mean, I was born here, so why wouldn't I want this to be better? And then you teach the tools of the government on how you be better, so that people who go and represent Congress and do these outlandish things and vote against the interests of the people. That's the argument. I have a deep affinity for rural America. Why? Because without them, America doesn't function. And they're probably the most forgotten people. I think I feel bad for some of the rural people as the Union soldiers came down and ransacked through different plantations and ruined their way of life. They should be upset because, wow, but they were victims of people hijacking what a patriot was in the first place, trying to keep things the way that they wanted to. So there's just, I mean, it's common power. We have a lot more in common than we do separately, and it all rests in becoming a more perfect union. So, I mean, patriotism is the heart of that. Patriotism is the hope that we should embrace.
Thanks, Ivory. Thanks for bringing it home there, Matt. For me, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody, let's take a moment to drop into the chat. Just kind of a thought for Ivory after his thoughts and spending his the energy